The book is called Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. The author is the associate editor of Reason magazine, or reason.com, Robby Soave. Who are these young radicals, Mr. Soave?
These are activists who are particularly causing issues on college campuses, although you can find them in the streets of places like Portland as well, who are different from kind of the old left that was all about free speech, due process, kind of ACLU values. What we're seeing now is a lot of attempts to shut down speakers who come to college campuses. Even the professors of the activist students who are purportedly on the left as well, the progressive left, say they can't have conversations with these students anymore, that they risk offending them, and if they do offend them, their jobs could be in trouble because they could be investigated. And it's really changing our culture very quickly and dramatically toward this cancel everybody. Everyone who's problematic has to be run out of public life, and that's coming from this kind of activist contingent on the young left.
And it's all on the left, not on the right?
No, it's very much on the right as well, and I do spend a chapter in my book talking about the illiberalism of the right, particularly the alt-right, which is a white nationalist group that has gotten some attention over the last few years. Like the radical left, small in number, but loud, vocal, and has had a huge effect in the realm of social media primarily, in harassing people and making it unpleasant to be online.
You say that intersectionality is the operating system of the modern left. What does that mean?
Intersectionality is a term that comes to us from sociology. It was coined in the late 1980s. It was used by a sociologist to describe how, so if you are a person of color, historically you would have experienced racism. If you're a woman, sexism, and so on and so forth. But if you're a black woman, you have multiple sources of oppression working against you. So there's nothing, so that theory makes total sense to me. But in intersectional sort of practice and activism, you're supposed to give the most oppressed person in the activist circle the most authority and most deference. Only they can be the experts on sources of oppression and on activism. So it starts to get a little thorny when, well, does this make me the most oppressed person if I have all these categories working against me? Well, what about these? And it's also lent itself toward, I think, an increasingly fragile mental health kind of activism on campuses, because I see young people who I think are sort of exaggerating the extent of their PTSD. I mean, when I talk to their professors and they say everyone in my classroom says they're a survivor of trauma, I think it's probably doubtful. But they're saying that because having PTSD gives you authority as an activist in these circles. So it's incentivizing people to see themselves as mentally unwell, which I think is a bad thing.
How did we get here?
It's an interesting question. It's a difficult question because we're talking about broad social and cultural change happening over a long period of time, so there's no easy answers. I do think that the changing regime or norms of safety culture in schools and schools and parenting have probably led to a generation that, through no fault of its own, is a little bit more coddled than the previous generations, or less resilient. Again, I'm not blaming young people for that. It's our schools have changed dramatically. If you were to go back to the 1970s, you would not find a police officer in a single school anywhere in America. Today, there are police officers in half of all public high schools. Schools are actually very safe. The headlines to the contrary are misleading. Schools have been the safest place for kids for the longest period of time, and crime has fallen dramatically. Young people are less at risk of kidnapping than ever before, all those things. But you would get the idea from going through school, from seeing parents arrested for letting their kids play by themselves, all those kinds of things, you would get the idea that, man, it is dangerous. And so the purpose of school is to protect me, right? Is to make me feel safe. And then when safety gets stretched to include emotional safety as well, I think that's when you start to see this tide against words that wound or words that hurt. Well, I need to be protected from that the same way the school is responsible for my physical well-being.
Is this in your view, a good trend or not?
I think it's very concerning, and again, I'm critical of the right as well, and I don't want to be, causing too much alarm, because I don't think it's a generational problem so much. The people we're talking about are a small subset of a radical fringe. However, they are having I think a really poisonous effect on our social kind of discussion, our culture right now. It's miserable to be online. We're seeing, for instance, young adult novel authors are canceling their books because their young sensitivity readers leaders are saying, well, you can't say that, that's problematic, that's cultural appropriation, we can't do that. There's a lot of conversations being closed off just because a small number of militant, radical people on the political extremes are saying so, and I think that is bad.
You give as an example in your book, Panic Attack, the documentary, or the movie, Boys Don't Cry.
Yes.
What happened?
So they invited at Reed College, a very progressive liberal arts college.
In Portland?
Yes, in Portland. They invited Kimberly Pierce, who was the director of that really groundbreaking film that had exposed American audiences to what it's like to be a transgender person. It was a sympathetic portrayal of a transgender person. The activists at this college, they shut down the event. They wouldn't let Kimberly Pierce speak. They put up signs saying expletives at her, like vile things. They hated her. But why? She had what you would think would be a progressive film. Well, she cast Hilary Swank in it back in the 90s, and Hilary Swank is not a trans person. So having cast, so this violates intersectionality because only a trans person should have been playing a trans role. So they hated her for that, which is so short-sighted and self-defeating. I mean, it wouldn't have been as big a film then if it had someone other than Hilary Swank in it. So that's just an example of the really, really like at each other's throats and self-defeating tactics that some of these activists are embracing, I think, because of the influence of intersectionality.
Charles Murray invited to Middlebury College. He and the professor who invited him both injured.
Right. Literally attacked. They were physically assaulted by protesters who thought it was so important to stop what was supposed to be a debate. It was going to be a debate between Murray's perspective and a left of center perspective, but they don't want that to happen. And when I interviewed from the book, and I said, well, don't you think you make Charles Murray or whoever it is look more sympathetic if you're shouting them down and actually using violence against them? Don't you think you're driving people toward them? And they say, we are about safety. We are keeping the marginalized people in our community safe from the harm of Charles Murray's words and views. So if he is allowed to come here and speak, we have contributed to the emotional or mental unrest of the people we care about, which is a kind of really different idea, I think, about how safety works. That it's the root of so much of this.
How small are these alt-right and Antifa groups that are far on the fringe?
I mean, I think they're extremely small. I mean, we're talking about, at many of these events, we're talking about dozens of people, maybe hundreds or thousands nationwide, and they feed each other, right? Because the far right shows up, and then the far left shows up, and then they throw things at each other.
Media
and they have
shows
violence.
up.
The media shows up. Well, because the media is you don't want to be ignored. The news is things that happen. So when these things happen, you kind of have to cover them. But the challenge for the media is contextualizing them and not making these things seem like they're happening more often than they actually are. But they are happening. I mean, there was violence in Portland against a journalist, a explicitly right-of-center journalist, Andy Ngo, who writes for the online magazine.
Who's also gay.
Yes, and he's gay, but because he's critical of Antifa's activities, they said that he has no right to cover us, and they beat him up when he tried to videotape what they were doing. And Antifa explicitly rejects the idea that people who disagree with them should have rights, or that the far right should have rights. They're a specifically illiberal aesthetic that I believe is sort of catching on a little bit. Not their tactics, but their philosophy that my enemies should not have rights because they're my enemies.
Mr. Soave, do you see a solution, and do you offer one in Panic Attack?
I think the best thing to do, particularly on college campuses, is to just answer bad speech with more speech, to say, no, I would like to hear Charles Murray talk, I would like to hear a different perspective. When the event happens, for the other students in the audience, who, by the way, are a majority, to just stand up and say, no, please stop, I would like to hear this. I want the professors, the left of center professors, to be able to talk to their students about the robust history of free speech activism on the left, and to not feel like their jobs are going to be at risk if they say the wrong thing. That's on the administrators to recognize the rights of faculty and to take, so they don't have to arrest students or throw them out of the campus. They need to just make a safe space, if you will, to actually be able to express ideas counter to these students and have those people not suffer consequences for doing so.
What are your politics?
I'm a libertarian, so I have very ideological beliefs, but interestingly, it sort of puts me in the center-ish of some of this stuff because I'm sympathetic to some of the goals of progressive activists. I talk about Black Lives Matter in the book. I agree with a lot of what they would like to accomplish. I think our criminal justice system is very flawed and has had a disparate impact on people of color. So it's from a position of occasionally wanting the left to succeed that I'm critiquing their tactics and saying, well, I think this is going to turn people off. Or you're saying that you need only the most woke, only the most radically progressive people are the ones you want to organize with and count as the good guys. Well, that's going to be like 6 people at the end of the day. Even you guys don't agree on all that stuff.
What attracted you to libertarianism?
I kind of have a boring libertarian origin story. I grew up in a Republican household, but my parents were libertarian. I think they didn't know that word exists in the Detroit area. They were, pro-business, but socially liberal, broadly speaking. And I eventually decided, yeah, that's what I am. And then I found Reason magazine, and I started reading a lot, and now I work there.
Robby Soave is the author of this book, Panic Attack: Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. Thanks for joining us on Book TV.
My pleasure. Thank you.